She was 12 years old when the last of her family closed the coffin lid, and the world she knew went with it into the ground. Her name was Ellender Voss, and on a gray October morning in the year 1887, in a river town called Merrow's Landing, she stood at the edge of a cemetery with nothing but a canvas sack, a woolen shawl too thin for the coming winter, and $4.60 sewn into the hem of her petticoat by her mother's own hand, weeks before the fever took her too. There was no aunt to send for, no uncle willing to claim her, and the deacon who might have found her a place in a respectable home instead found reasons to look away. She slept in barns. She swept floors for bread. And when she heard that the old Icehouse down by Miller's Creek, abandoned, half-collapsed, and shunned by every soul in town for reasons no one would speak plainly, was being sold for pennies because no one else would touch it, she walked 3 miles in the cold and bought it with the last of her mother's sewn-in coins. The men at the courthouse laughed. They called a foolish girl's foolish waist. They did not know that beneath the packed sawdust and the black ice of that forgotten building lay something that would not only save Ellender Voss from the winter closing around her, it would return to Merrow's Landing a piece of itself it had buried and lost and mourned in silence for 11 long years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ellender Voss. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, we want you to know, we see you, and we're glad you're here. Ellender had not always been alone. Before the fever, before the coffins, there had been a small clapboard house on the north edge of Merrow's Landing with a red door her father had painted himself, insisting that a red door was good luck, that it told a weary traveler this house has room for you. Thomas Voss had been a cooper by trade, a broad, quiet man who built barrels and butter churns and, in his spare hours, taught his only daughter the patience of good work, how a stave had to be shaped just so, how a hoop had to be driven true, how a job rushed was a job wasted. Her mother, Naomi, had been the daughter of a Vermont ice cutter, and it was from her that Ellender first learned the strange, exacting science of ice, how it had to be cut in the deep cold of January when it was thickest and clearest, hauled from the pond in great glistening blocks, and packed in sawdust and straw inside a windowless house built low and snug against the earth, where if the work was done with care, it would last clean to the blistering months of July and August. Naomi used to say that ice was patience made solid, that anyone could chop a block from a frozen pond, but only a careful hand could keep it whole until the world needed it most. She said this while packing sawdust with her bare fingers, showing Ellender how to leave no gaps, how a single careless corner could rot a whole season's harvest. Ellender listened the way children listen to things they do not yet know they will need. She did not know, at 8 years old, packing play blocks of ice into a toy crate behind the cooper's shop, that her mother was handing her a trade that would one day save her life. There was another lesson, quieter and harder to name, that both her parents gave her without ever quite saying aloud, that worth was not always visible on the surface, and that the things people threw away or walked past were not always worthless, only unseen. Thomas would take splintered, rejected staves that other coopers discarded, and show Ellender how, with patience, they could still be shaped into something sound. Naomi would take a bruised apple no one wanted at market and turn it into the sweetest preserve in the county. Merrow's Landing was a river town of some 1,400 souls in those years, built on lumber money and the steamboat trade, prosperous enough to have 2 churches and a bank with marble steps. But like any town that had a memory, it preferred not to touch. Ellender did not yet know this. She knew only that her father hummed while he worked, that her mother's hands smelled of pine sawdust and peppermint, and that on winter evenings the 3 of them sat by the stove while Thomas told her stories of the old ice harvest, of a night, years before she was born, when half the town had turned out at Miller's Creek with lanterns and saws to bring in the harvest before a warm spell could ruin it, and how the Icehouse down there, back then, had been the proudest building in Merrow's Landing, run by a man named Silas Bramwell who was, by every account she ever heard, generous almost to a fault. Her father would grow quiet whenever he mentioned Bramwell's name, and change the subject, and Ellender, being young, thought nothing of it. The fever came in the late summer of 1887, sweeping up from the river the way such things did in those days, indifferent to a family's kindness or their red door or their careful, patient hands. It took her father first, in the space of 9 days, and her mother 11 days after that, weakened past fighting by grief and exhaustion, and the same sickness that had already claimed the man she loved. Ellender nursed them both as best a girl of 12 could, boiling rags, carrying water, sitting up through nights so long she lost count of them. And when it was over, she was alone in a house that no longer felt like a house at all, only a shape with her family's absence poured into every room of it. The bank, it turned out, held a note on the Cooper's shop that Thomas had never fully spoken of, taken out 2 winters before to see them through a lean season. And within a month of the second funeral, a man from the bank came with papers and an apologetic manner and took the house, the shop, and every tool her father had ever touched, leaving Ellender with the canvas sack, the shawl, and the coins her mother had sewn into her petticoat for a day Naomi must have feared was coming. The town of Merrow's Landing did not turn its back on Ellender all at once. It happened slowly, the way most abandonments do, in 100 small refusals rather than one cruel word. Families who had known her parents for years found reasons why they could not take in an extra mouth. The deacon, a narrow man named Ezra Colfax, who ran the poor relief of the county, looked at her sack and her petticoat and decided, without ever quite saying so, that a girl with even a little money sewn into her hem was not truly destitute, and therefore not as concerned. She slept where she could, in the loft of the Hargrove barn in exchange of morning chores, in the back room of the seamstress's shop for 2 weeks, until the seamstress's husband complained of the expense of feeding her, on a pew in the smaller of the 2 churches one bitter night, when no other door would open. She learned quickly which houses would give a hungry girl bread, without asking too many questions, and which would call the constable if she lingered on a step too long. Through it all, she kept her mother's coins hidden and untouched, some stubborn instinct telling her that whatever those $4.60 were meant for, it had not yet arrived, and she would know it when it did. It was in the second week of October, with the first hard frost silvering the grass, and every soul in Merrow's Landing beginning to speak of the coming winter the way people speak of a debt they cannot pay, that Ellender heard 2 men talking outside the general store about the old Icehouse at Miller's Creek going up for sale at the courthouse. One called it a rotten heap, not worth the nails holding it together. The other laughed and said no one in their right mind would touch it, not after what had happened to Bramwell, not with the stories that still clung to the place like frost to a window pane. Ellender did not know what had happened to Bramwell. She knew only the word Icehouse and something in her chest, some quiet inheritance from her mother's careful, sawdust-scented hands. Sat up and took notice. She went to the courthouse the next morning, a small figure in a coat 2 sizes too large, and stood at the back of a thin crowd of men who had come more out of curiosity than intent to buy. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Corliss with a voice like a rusted gate, described the property in the flat. Dismissive tone of a man reading off an inventory of junk. 1 Icehouse, Miller's Creek, condemned by the county as unsafe, structure compromised, contents unknown and sold as is, no warranty given or implied. When he opened the bidding at $2, the men around Ellender chuckled and shook their heads, and not one hand went up. Corliss dropped the price to $1, and still nothing. It was Ellender, small and cold and possessed of a stubbornness she could not have named, who raised her hand and said, in a voice that came out steadier than she felt, that she would give 50 cents. The crowd laughed outright then. A child, buying condemned building no grown man in town would claim. But Corliss, eager to be rid of property and done with his morning's work, brought down his little wooden hammer, and pronounced the Icehouse at Miller's Creek sold to Miss Ellender Voss for 2 quarters, and the astonishment of everyone present. She walked the 3 miles to Miller's Creek that same afternoon with the deed folded inside her coat, her breath fogging in the sharp air, following a rutted lane that grew narrower and less traveled with every turn until the trees opened onto a clearing she almost did not recognize as the proud building of her father's old stories. The Icehouse crouched low against a rise of ground above the creek, built the old way, half sunk into the earth with thick log walls meant to hold the cold, but the roof had caved in on one corner, and vines had climbed the north wall, as if trying to pull the whole structure back down into the ground it had once been dug from. The double doors, warped and swollen with years of weather, hung slightly open, and a smell came from within, not the clean, mineral smell of ice that Ellender remembered from her mother's descriptions, but something older and stranger, like a cellar that had been sealed too long. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, 12 years old and entirely alone in the world, and then, because there was nowhere else for her to go and no one left to tell her not to, she pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the failing daylight through the broken roof, and the floor was uneven beneath a crust of old sawdust gone black and hard as coal with age. Ellender picked her way carefully, remembering her mother's warnings about rotted floorboards and old ice cellars, and it was this very carefulness, this inherited habit of testing ground before trusting it, that saved her from a fall and led her, in the same motion, to her first discovery. Her boot caught not on a hole, but on a raised seam in the floor, aligned with the packed earth and old sawdust, gave way to something harder and more regular beneath. She knelt, brushing away years of grime with cold fingers, and found the edge of a wooden trapdoor, iron-ringed and nearly invisible beneath its disguise of dirt, sent to floor the icehouse exactly where, if her mother's teachings held true anywhere in the world, the old ice pit itself would have been dug deepest to hold the harvest longest into summer. It took her the better part of an hour, working in the thinning light with a rusted pry bar she found leaning against the wall, to work the trapdoor loose from its swollen frame. When it finally gave, it did so all at once, swinging up with a groan of old hinges and releasing a breath of air so cold and so strange that Ellender rocked back on her heels, startled, as though the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Below the trapdoor, a set of narrow log steps descended into darkness, and at the bottom, faint in the gray light falling from above, she could see the pale gleam of something that did not belong to any ordinary ice house she had ever heard described. A gleam too regular, too deliberate, to be simple frost on stone. She did not go down that first evening. Even a girl with nothing left to lose has some sense of caution, and the light was failing, and the cold was climbing, and Ellender knew enough to understand that whatever waited at the bottom of those steps had waited this long already and would wait one night more. She pulled the trapdoor closed as best she could, wedged the warped outer door shut behind her, and walked back to town in the deepening dark with her heart beating harder than the cold alone could explain, carrying inside her, for the first time since her parents' deaths, something that felt almost like hope. She returned at first light the next morning with a stub of candle bag from the seamstress and a borrowed lantern. She promised to return by nightfall, and this time she went down the narrow steps into the pit beneath the icehouse floor. What she found there, in the wavering candlelight, was not treasure in the way a fairy tale might promise it, but something stranger and, in its own way, far more valuable. A chamber dug deep into the cold earth, lined with the same careful log construction as the icehouse above, and stacked along its walls, wrapped in oiled canvas and packed to what remained of ancient sawdust, dozens upon dozens of sealed stoneware crocks and wooden cases, along with a small iron-bound chest set apart from, the rest on a raised wooden platform, as though it had been placed there with particular deliberation. Ellender's hands shook as she worked open the lid of the nearest crock, and the smell that rose from it, sharp, sweet, unmistakably the smell of preserved fruit gone through decades of slow fermentation, told her before her eyes fully confirmed it that she had found not gold, not silver, but a harvest that someone had sealed away, deliberately and carefully, and never come back to claim. The iron-bound chest took longer to open, its lock rusted solid, and when at last she forced it with a pry bar, she found inside not coin but paper, a thick ledger bound in leather gone soft with age, and beneath it, folded with particular care a man who expected his words to matter, a letter addressed, in a strong, careful hand, to whoever finds this. Ellender sat on the cold steps with a lantern beside her and read words that had waited 11 years for an audience. And as she read, the whole shape of the icehouse's silence and the town's strange reluctance to speak of it began, at last, to make sense. The letter was signed Silas Bramwell, and it told, in plain and sorrowful language, a story the town of Merrow's Landing had chosen to forget rather than remember rightly. Bramwell, it seemed, had run the icehouse at Miller's Creek for near 20 years, and had done so with a generosity that had become, in the town's own telling, almost a joke. He gave ice freely to families who could not pay in the worst months of summer fever. He kept a running account of debts he quietly forgave, and in the autumn of 1876, when the river flooded and half the lumber mills along its banks were ruined and dozens of families faced a winter with empty larders, Silas Bramwell had done something the town never fully understood at the time. He had spent the last of his own savings buying up the flood-damaged harvest, crates of apples, barrels of cider, sacks of grain that the ruined mills could no longer store or sell at prices far above their worth, not because he needed them, but because he could not bear to watch his neighbors' hard work rot in a flooded warehouse while their children went hungry that winter. He had preserved what could be preserved, packed a rest in the cold, dry chamber beneath his icehouse to keep it through the crisis, and intended, so the letter said, to distribute it through the worst months as families needed it, quietly, so that no man's pride would be wounded by the taking of charity. But before he could begin that distribution, the bank that held a note on his own icehouse, the very same bank, Ellender realized with a cold jolt that had taken her father's cooper shop 11 years later, had called in Bramwell's debt without warning, seizing what visible property he had and forcing him from the town within weeks, ruined and humiliated by men who never troubled to ask why an unmarried ice cutter had suddenly gone so deeply into debt. Bramwell had sealed the underground chamber before he left, unwilling to let the bank's agent strip it bare and sell off charity meant for struggling neighbors to line their own pockets, and had written his letter in the desperate hope that someone, someday, would find a hidden harvest and understand what it was for. He had died, the letter's final lines revealed with quiet sorrow, believing it failed the very people he meant to save, that his generosity had ruined him and helped no one, and that the town, not knowing the truth, had simply decided he was a man who ran from his debts. Ellender sat for a long while in the cold beneath the icehouse floor, the lantern burning low, and felt something shift inside her that was larger than her own hunger and her own homelessness. She understood, with the clear, uncomplicated logic of a child who has learned hard lessons early, that she was not simply the owner of a condemned building now. She was the keeper of a promise 11 years overdue. Word travels fast in a small river town, and it did not take long before Ellender's strange purchase and stranger discovery reached the ears of Merrill's Landing's leading citizens, chief among them a banker named Horace Pruitt, a stout, silver-whiskered man who had inherited his position and his fortune from a father who had built the very bank that once seized Silas Bramwell's property, and who had, in the years since, grown accustomed to a town that deferred to him without question. Pruitt arrived at the Icehouse 3 days after Ellender's discovery, accompanied by 2 clerks in a manner of icy politeness that did not fully conceal his alarm. He informed Ellender, with the confident air of a man reciting settled law, that the contents of any structure seized and later sold by the county reverted, by rights, to whichever party held the original lien, meaning, he explained with a thin smile, the bank itself. He offered her $10 for her trouble in the deed, a sum meant to sound generous to a homeless orphan, and was, in truth, an insult dressed as kindness. When Ellender, drawing on a steadiness she did not entirely feel, asked to see the paperwork proving such a claim, Pruitt's smile faltered, because no such paperwork existed. The county had sold the property outright, condemned and unclaimed, precisely because the bank had never troubled to assert any lasting interest in a building it considered worthless the moment Silas Bramwell was driven from town. What Pruitt had not counted on was that Ellender, in the days since her discovery, had not been idle. She had shown the ledger and Bramwell's letter to the one person in Merrill's Landing who had never once turned her away, Reverend Amos Hale of the smaller church, an elderly, soft-spoken man who remembered Bramwell not as a debtor who fled, but as a friend who had once, in secret, paid the Reverend's own mother's medical bills during a hard winter. Hale, reading the ledger with trembling hands, recognized in its careful entries the names of families still living in Merrill's Landing. The Osgoods, the Feathertons, the Delacroix family down by the mill, each entry a debt Bramwell had quietly forgiven, each name a thread connecting the sealed chamber beneath the icehouse to the living town above it. Together, the old Reverend and the 12-year-old girl began, carefully and without fanfare, to tell the true story of Silas Bramwell to anyone willing to listen, and to make clear that whatever Ellender had found beneath that ice, she intended to use as Bramwell himself had intended it, not for herself alone, but for the town that had forgotten him. Horace Pruitt did not surrender easily. He brought the matter before the county judge, a cautious man named Iverson who had no particular love for the bank, but even less appetite for controversy. And for a tense fortnight, it seemed the whole discovery might be swallowed up in legal argument, while Ellender, still without a proper roof overhead, waited in the cold. It was the ledger itself that turned the tide, for among its careful entries Reverend Hale found notation, dated mere weeks before Bramwell's ruin, recording a debt the bank's own founder, Pruitt's late father, had owed to Bramwell and never repaid, a debt for ice and preserve stores supplied on credit during a lean season years before the flood. When this entry was read aloud in the crowded little courtroom, and elderly townsfolk in the gallery, began murmuring their own half-forgotten memories of Bramwell's kindness. Horace Pruitt's confident claim to the chamber's contents crumbled beneath the weight of a truth the town had buried longer than the harvest itself. Judge Iverson ruled plainly that the property, condemned and sold at open auction with contents unknown, belonged in full to Ellender Voss, and that any prior claim the bank believed it held had died the moment it abandoned Silas Bramwell to ruin, without so much as an inventory of what it left behind. What Ellender did next was not the act of a girl seeking to secure her own comfortable future, though comfort, by then, would have been forgiven her. She sold what could be sold to preserve harvest at fair prices to buyers from up and down the river, and with Reverend Hale's steady guidance, used a portion of the proceeds to settle, quietly and without public announcement, every debt still recorded unpaid in Bramwell's ledger, exactly as he had intended 11 years before. A sack of seed corn here, a winter's worth of preserved stores there, delivered anonymously to doors that had long since given up hope of relief. She used another portion to repair the Icehouse itself, restoring it board by board with the same patient care her father had once shown a rejected stave, until it stood again, snug and sound above Miller's Creek, ready to hold a new harvest through a new winter. And she used the last of it, along with the trade her mother had taught her in a cooper's yard long before the fever came, to reopen the Icehouse under her own management, hiring on two of the very families, the Feathertons and the Delacroix, whose names she had read in Bramwell's ledger, and whose fathers, once helped by a man the town chose to forget, now helped a girl the town had once cast aside. Horace Pruitt, for his part, faced no dramatic public reckoning, no mob at his door, no ruin to match the one his family's bank had once dealt Silas Bramwell. His justice was quieter and, in its way, more fitting. The story of his father's forgotten debt and his own attempt to claim a dead man's charity for the bank's coffers spread through Merrill's Landing exactly as gossip does in small towns, softly and thoroughly, until men who had once tipped their hats to him began instead to remember and to speak in low voices at the general store of what kind of family truly could not be trusted with a neighbor's trust. He kept his position and his fortune, but he lost, slowly and irreversibly, the easy deference of a town that had finally learned to look twice at generosity dressed as debt. And so it was that Ellender Voss, orphaned at 12, cast out by a town too busy or too frightened to claim her, found in a condemned Icehouse bought for 2 quarters not merely a roof and a trade, but the unfinished kindness of a man long dead, and the chance to finish it herself. She had come to Miller's Creek with nothing but her mother's careful hands and her father's patient heart, inherited traits she had not known she carried until the moment they were needed most, and she had found, beneath layers of frost and neglect and 11 years of silence, that the coldest, most forgotten places sometimes hold the warmest truths, waiting only for someone patient enough to dig and honest enough to finish what was started. The Icehouse at Miller's Creek stands today, in this telling, not as a monument to what one man lost, but as proof of what one girl, given the smallest of chances, chose to give back. Thank you for spending this time with Ellender's story and with us. If it moved you even a little, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that value is not always visible on the surface. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a time you found worth in something the world had already written off. A person, a place, an old forgotten thing that turned out to matter more than anyone knew. Until next time, stay close.